Jewish couple vanished during World War II. 70 years later, a wall collapse reveals a hidden bedroom. The house had always been quiet. The kind of quiet that felt intentional. Not the gentle hush of an old home growing soft with age, but the kind that presses itself into corners, that waits. It stood at the end of a narrow cobbled lane in Krakow, Poland, 3 stories tall, walls weathered to ash gray, with ivy that had grown wild across the rear facade like nature itself had tried to wrap the place in a blanket. For decades, no one had lived there. The building had changed hands, changed neighbors, but never quite changed itself. It had stood empty since 1945, a ghost among newer, livelier homes that breathed and buzzed with radios, television, and coffee cups clinking in kitchen sinks. But this one, it just watched. Locals passed it without glancing too long. Contractors refused to work on it. Realtors called it difficult to list. And yet, in the spring of 2015, the silence finally broke. A construction team had been hired to renovate the crumbling rear wing, a last-ditch effort to salvage the property for resale. The plan was straightforward. Tear down the inner plaster, reinforce the outer brick, modernize the plumbing. Nothing about it was supposed to matter, until the wall fell. It didn't fall like walls normally do, not in pieces, not from a careless hammer. It crumbled all at once, as if tired of pretending. Dust poured from the breach like smoke. Behind it, not rot, not insulation, but a sealed room. A bedroom, perfectly preserved. The air that spilled out smelled of old linen, mothballs, and something else, something floral and faintly warm, like rosewater caught in fabric. The workers froze. One called the foreman called the city. And by that evening, the news had reached the local preservation office. A hidden room had been discovered in a building last documented in full during the Nazi occupation. A few hours later, a historian named Lena Weiss arrived with gloves, a flashlight, and the kind of silence reserved for places where the dead might still be listening. She didn't step in right away. She stood in the threshold, letting her eyes adjust. The room was small, no more than 10 feet across, lit only by the flashlight beam that caught in the floating dust. But what it revealed made her breath catch. A narrow bed, still made. A side table with a brass lamp, untouched by time. Books stacked carefully. A wardrobe with one door cracked open. And on the desk, beside an old fountain pen and dried inkwell, a stack of yellowed letters tied with blue ribbon. Everything in the room suggested someone had left it mid-sentence. Not in panic, not in flight, but as if they'd intended to return. The walls were still papered. The linen still held the faint outline of where someone had last sat. The windows had been bricked over from the outside. Whoever sealed this room had done so with care and with purpose. But it wasn't the room itself that pulled at Lena. It was what she found inside the wardrobe. A coat, men's size, heavy wool, and in the pocket, an envelope, addressed in careful cursive, for Samuel und Shava Stein, MIT alum was blight. For Samuel and Shava Stein, with all that remains. There were no records of the Steins living in that house. No mention of them in the census from 1939. No neighbors remembered them. It was as if they had lived in silence, and then vanished into it. But now, 70 years later, their room had spoken. And it had not whispered. It had waited. Samuel Stein had once believed Krakow would survive the war untouched. Not because he was naive, but because he had to. Hope was not a luxury for men like him in 1943. It was scaffolding. He was a tailor by trade, a third-generation craftsman whose shop sat neatly between a bakery and a bookstore on Josepha Street in Kazimierz, the Jewish quarter that had once thrummed with life. He stitched suits in silence most days, the sound of thread and shears keeping him grounded when the world outside grew too loud. Shava, his wife, was a piano teacher. Elegant, composed, the kind of woman who moved like a breath through a room. She had a laugh that made people stop to listen. Before the occupation, she taught at a conservatory. After, she gave lessons quietly in their parlor, her students arriving 2 at a time, shoulders hunched, eyes scanning the street before knocking. They were not wealthy. They were not activists, but they were visible, and that alone became dangerous. By the spring of 1943, Krakow was no longer Krakow. The Jewish quarter had been emptied, its residents deported or relocated to the ghetto in Podgors across the river. But Samuel and Shava, through a mixture of quiet fortune and the kindness of their landlord, an old friend of Samuel's father, remained in their home. The authorities hadn't come for them yet. Perhaps someone had misplaced a file. Perhaps someone had chosen, briefly, to look the other way. They lived like shadows in their own house. Blackout curtains drawn tight, meals cooked in whispers, music played only when the trams passed to cover the sound. But fear had a way of distorting time. Each day stretched long, then disappeared all at once. Rumors came and went like weather. There were lists now, people said, names being recorded, and always the trains. The first time Shava heard the knocking on the neighbor's door, she didn't understand what it meant. She peeked through the curtain and saw Mrs. Edelman, 2 sons clutching her skirt, being led down the steps by a soldier who didn't look old enough to shave. She never came back. That night, Samuel didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at a worn Torah scroll wrapped in cloth, his grandfather's. "We need to decide," he whispered. Shava stood at the stove, her hands still, her body like a statue. "You want to run?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. He shook his head. "I want to disappear." And so they did, but not into the forest, not onto forged documents, not into another country, into their own home. Samuel had once helped a man wall off a hidden storeroom behind a bakery in Sandomierz years before. The knowledge stayed with him: brickwork, plaster seams, how to layer soundproofing between lathe strips. In the weeks that followed, he gathered supplies one item at a time. Cement from an abandoned lot, wood from a junked carriage, flour sacks, canned preserves, candles. Shava handled the rationing, the list-making, the sewing of false panels into their clothing in case they ever needed to carry something unseen. It became their secret, spoken only in glances and careful touches as they moved through their days like ghosts preparing for burial. When the time came, they built the wall together. It took 3 nights. They worked without speaking, by candlelight. The room was small, once Chava's childhood bedroom, but it would do. The window was sealed, the vents repurposed from an old stovepipe. The bed frame was braced into the wall. Books, blankets, the journal Shava had written in since she was 13, it all went behind the bricks. On the last night, Samuel turned to her and said, "If we do this, we do it until it ends. No peeking, no sound, not even to check." Shava nodded. "Promise me something," she said. "If one of us must leave first, the other waits." Samuel held her face in both hands. "There is no one first. Only both. Only together." The next day they vanished. The tailor shop was closed. The music stopped. Neighbors whispered, but no one knocked. And behind the new wall, Samuel and Shava sat in silence. 2 chairs, 1 bed, a radio that barely whispered static, and time that no longer belonged to the outside world. They had buried themselves in memory, in love, in the space between heartbeat and history. And the city moved on, as cities do, forgetting what it could not explain. At first, they counted the days. Shava marked them softly into the back of her old music journal, 1 thin scratch per sunrise. It gave them something solid, a rhythm to hold on to as time outside moved unpredictably. Samuel estimated that an hourglass from an old sewing machine bobbin gave them a sense of passing time. Not accurate, but comforting. They set it on the desk beside the lamp and flipped it at least 10 times a day. By week 2, the hourglass cracked. By week 4, Shava stopped drawing lines. The silence had changed shape by then. No longer just quiet, but dense, the kind that fills your ears with your own blood. Outside, life seemed to carry on. Distant footsteps, a voice here and there, a dog barking down the lane. But in their hidden room, it was like being on a ship submerged beneath ice. Everything was muffled, muted, suspended. They spoke in whispers, even when they knew no one could hear them. It wasn't fear anymore. It was reverence. like the walls had absorbed their secret and now demanded they honor it. They filled the hours carefully. Samuel stitched scraps of cloth into squares, squares into blankets. He taught Shava how to sew buttonholes, how to fix hems without a needle breaking. Shava recited poetry from memory. She had once loved Anna Akhmatova, and sometimes she would whisper lines into the seam of Samuel's shoulder while he worked. I know the names of all things, of birds, of constellations, of ships, of flowers. He would smile but never stop stitching. They made games of silence. They played chess from memory, moving pieces only they could see. They shared stories from before soldiers, before shadows. He told her about the time he slipped on black ice and ruined a man's wedding trousers 3 hours before the ceremony. She told him about the girl she once kissed behind the conservatory just to know what it felt like. But as the months passed, or what they believed were months, the weight of stillness pressed in. Their food supply began to shrink. Samuel had calculated carefully, but no plan survives the burden of waiting. The bread grew hard. The beans dried out. The canned peaches were saved for a special day, though neither of them knew what that meant anymore. They rationed candles, bathed with water stored in metal pails. At night, the room grew so cold Shava sometimes woke with her teeth chattering, even under 3 layers of blankets. Samuel warmed her hands between his own. "Tell me something new," she'd whisper. "There is nothing new," he'd answer. "Then tell me something again." And he would, again and again, the same stories, rewound and reshaped until they felt like prayer. The hardest part was not knowing if the war was over, if Krakow still stood, if the world outside the wall even remembered their names. Some nights, they imagined the entire city had vanished, swallowed by smoke and silence, that they were the last 2 people left. Other nights, Shava would place her hand against the bricked-over window and try to feel the warmth of sunlight she hadn't touched in months. "I used to think light was a thing you could carry," she told Samuel once. "But now I think it's only borrowed. Like music. They never fought. Not in the way people fight when the world is normal. There was no space for sharpness. But some days, the silence grew too loud, and one of them would snap. Samuel muttering under his breath about how he should have planned better. Shava standing too long at the corner of the room, as if waiting for a door that didn't exist. They always apologized quickly. Always returned to the center of the room where the warmth still lived between them. Because without each other, the room became something else. Not sanctuary, not hiding place, but tomb. And yet there were moments. Small ones. Real ones. One night, Shava played a melody on the table with her fingers, the rhythm slow and haunting. "I think it was WWII," she said. "Or maybe something I made up." Samuel hummed along. Another day, she found a pressed flower in one of her old books. A violet, flattened and browned. "From our anniversary," she whispered, holding it like a relic. "Do you remember where we went?" "Of course," he said, though neither of them were sure. Then came the night the voices stopped. No footsteps, no dogs, no trains, only wind. And they knew something had changed. Shava whispered, "What if it's over?" Samuel said nothing, because he didn't know what over meant anymore. The lentils ran out first, then the rice. The dried herbs Shava used to disguise the monotony of boiled grains disappeared soon after. By the end of what they believed was the 6th month, they had only 3 tins left: sardines, black bread hardened to stone, and the canned peaches they hadn't dared touch. Samuel wanted to save them for their wedding anniversary. Shava, increasingly brittle in both body and voice, reminded him they no longer knew when that was. Hunger did something cruel to the mind. It stretched the hours until every creak in the floorboard became a temptation, every stale smell a phantom of food. Samuel, once broad-shouldered, looked smaller now. His hands, once so steady with thread and cloth, trembled even when still. Shava's cheekbones sharpened. Her eyes, once filled with so much music, seemed to flicker under the weight of quiet dread. They stopped playing chess. The imaginary pieces had begun to look too real, and neither wanted to admit who kept losing. But more than the hunger, it was the air that began to shift. Subtle at first, like a sigh held in the lungs of the walls. Then stronger, like a second breath in the room, not theirs. One evening, as Samuel was patching a blanket and Shava dozed with her head on the desk, a strange noise rang out. Not from the street, not from above, from behind the wall. A thud, then nothing. He froze, listened. It didn't come again. He didn't wake Shava. But from that night on, the silence stopped being still. Sometimes they'd hear whispers, indistinct, like water in the pipes or voices through a dream. Sometimes footsteps. Once a violin. They told themselves it was memory. Shava began writing again, not in her journal, which she now kept under her pillow like a secret, but in scraps of paper torn from old music sheets. She called them reminders. One read, "If I forget the color of my mother's hair, it is not because I stopped loving her." Another, the scent of almond oil. The sound of keys in the hallway. Do not lose these. She tucked them into books, under the mattress, inside her shoes. When Samuel found one near the sink, it said, "Don't trust the stillness. It's listening." He asked her gently what she meant. She shrugged. "Maybe it's not about what we hear," she said. "Maybe it's about what hears us." And that's when the dreams began. For both of them. Not nightmares, not exactly. Just replays. The sound of their door unlocking. The rush of boots. A name shouted down the corridor. But they would wake in silence, gasping, only to find themselves still within their hiding place, still alive. Still not found. Still waiting. There were days Shava couldn't get out of bed. Her hands, once so graceful, could no longer hold a cup without spilling. Samuel spoon-fed her broth made from hot water and one withered carrot. He began talking aloud more, filling the room with stories. Of how they met. How she once sang to him through the open window of her music room. How he snuck into her conservatory with a bouquet of stitched silk flowers when he couldn't afford real ones. Shava would smile barely, but her eyes remained fixed on the corner of the ceiling, as if expecting someone or something to arrive. Then one night, she whispered something in the dark that made Samuel freeze. "I don't think we're alone in here." He turned toward her. "You mean the walls?" "I mean something else. I think we're being remembered." He wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to fever or fatigue. But he felt it too, the pressure in the air. The way their names seemed to hum faintly when the candle flickered, as if someone somewhere was trying to reach back, and not to save them, to hear them. They say some places hold memory the way lungs hold breath, not forever, but long enough to matter. And in that sealed bedroom behind the wall, Samuel and Shava were no longer just residents of their own past. They had become part of it. The room was changing, not physically, but in feel, in weight. There were times the candlelight bent strangely, stretching shadows across the wallpaper in shapes that didn't match their bodies. Once, Samuel swore he heard the echo of Chava's voice whispering his name, only to turn and find her fast asleep, lips parted, breath shallow. Another time, Shava claimed she saw the corners of the bookshelf flicker. Just a soft pulse, like the light was remembering where it had once landed before the window was bricked over. It wasn't frightening, not at first. It was sad, like the room knew what they were losing, and couldn't bear to forget it. They both began writing more, not just to pass the time, but to anchor themselves. Samuel stitched words into fabric, tiny letters sewn into the seams of his coat. "We were here." Shava wrote poems, mostly unfinished. She left them tucked inside books, in the folds of pillowcases, behind the baseboards. Words became their footprints. They no longer believed they'd ever leave the room alive, but they believed, with quiet certainty, that someone might walk through it again. And they wanted to be found the way you find a pressed flower between pages. Fragile, yes, but unmistakably intended. Then came the night when the breathing changed. They had grown used to the quiet murmurs, the occasional shiver in the air. But that evening, what little warmth the room still held seemed to draw inward, as if the walls had taken a breath and held it. The candle guttered. The journal pages fluttered though there was no wind. Shava sat upright, eyes wide, suddenly alert despite the weakness in her limbs. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Samuel had. Not a sound. A presence. Not like before. Closer. More curious than ominous. Then faintly a knock. 3 taps. Soft. Measured. From the inside wall. They stared at each other, breath caught in their throats. "It's the bookshelf," Shava whispered. Behind it, Samuel stood slowly, legs stiff, joints cracking like wood under snow. He moved the shelf aside, books toppling, dust clouding the air, until bare plaster showed. And there, almost invisible, were words, scratched faintly into the wall with what must have been a nail or needle. "You are not gone. I am listening." Shava covered her mouth, not in fear, but reverence. That night, neither of them slept. They held each other under the thin blanket, listening. To the house, to the silence, to the possibility that the room itself had begun to remember them. Not just as its occupants, but as its heartbeat. The next morning, the journal was no longer under Chava's pillow. It was open on the desk, to a blank page. But the candle, which had burned down to its base, was somehow whole again. The wax uncracked, the wick unused, and in the center of the page, 70 years is not so long when love waits. Shava cried for the first time in weeks. Not from hunger, not from exhaustion, from recognition. Someone was listening. Someone would come. And when they did, they would not find ghosts. They would find the traces of 2 people who refused to be erased. Lena Weiss had read about hundreds of hidden rooms over the course of her career. Concealed cellars in Czech barns, narrow attic spaces above synagogues in Slovakia, even a false-bottomed well in Vilnius that once hid 6 children for 2 months. But none of those places had felt like this. This wasn't a hole scratched out in desperation. This was a chamber built to remember. There was no dust on the letters, no mold on the bedding. The brass lamp still gleamed faintly when her flashlight passed over it. And the scent, not mildew or rot, but something almost floral, familiar, lavender. No rosewater. It lingered like perfume applied decades ago and never quite left. As if someone had only just stepped out. As if Samuel and Shava had only slipped into another room and would be back before sunset. She didn't touch anything at first. Just walked slowly through the space with the reverence of someone tiptoeing through a memory not their own. Her breath came shallow. Not out of fear, but because speaking aloud felt wrong. Like raising your voice at a funeral. She knelt beside the desk. The journal lay open, a strip of blue ribbon tucked halfway through. Her gloved hands hovered for a moment, then gently turned the page. And there it was, the final entry. No date, no salutation, just a single sentence, written in looping, feminine script. "If you found this, then we are still here." She sat back hard onto the floorboards, knees pulled to her chest, heart knocking against her ribs. It wasn't just the words, it was the immediacy, the present tense. She looked up at the bed. The pillow still bore the faint dip of a head. The blanket folded back. The wardrobe open just enough to suggest motion. It didn't feel like archaeology. It felt like interruption. She called the department, then the city, then the registry office. And by the end of the week, she was standing in the National Archives holding a faded ledger that hadn't been opened in 40 years. No record of the Steins owning the property. No legal documents. But buried 3 pages into a neighborhood census from 1939, in the margins beside a name crossed out in red pencil, someone had written. Neighbors said they disappeared March 43. Taylor. Wife played piano. No record of relocation. Lena returned to the room daily after that. She cataloged carefully, photographed everything, but she also listened. The air never felt still. When she stood in the doorway too long, her skin tingled, like stepping into static. When she opened a drawer, sometimes the candle would flicker in response, despite there being no wind. Once, while sorting through the books stacked by the bed, she found a paper tucked inside a volume of Hebrew poetry. Don't forget the almond oil. The keys in the hallway. These things are anchors. She didn't know what it meant, but she didn't file it. She kept it in her coat pocket, carried it with her everywhere, as if it wanted to be near. One evening, as she sat on the floor cross-legged beneath the desk, rereading the journal, she heard it. 3 knocks, soft, from the wall behind her, exactly as Shava once described. She froze. Her flashlight buzzed slightly in her hand. The candle, the one she had never lit, flickered. She turned. There was no one, no draft, no movement, only the faint scent of something sweet. And when she turned back to the journal, a page she had not seen before was now unfolded at the back. In Samuel's handwriting, "We chose to vanish, but not to be forgotten. If you can still read this, you are part of the remembering." She exhaled slowly. Something had been waiting for her. Not a haunting, a handoff, a relay across time. And she realized then, this wasn't an ending. This was a threshold. Lena began sleeping less. Not out of fear, but purpose. The room had burrowed into her thoughts like a thread pulled through cloth, gentle at first, then pulling tighter, guiding her. She returned every morning before sunrise, when the air in Krakow was still and the light pooled slowly into the gaps of the broken plaster. She didn't treat it like a job anymore. It had become personal, as if the room had chosen her. The journal now rested on her nightstand. The scrap of poetry Shava had written, "Don't forget the almond oil," stayed tucked inside her coat. She carried it like a charm, touching it without thinking whenever her mind wandered. Her colleagues at the historical department joked that she was haunted, but they didn't say it unkindly. They saw the change in her. She was quieter now, focused, moved like someone reading invisible text carved in the air. The hidden messages started surfacing slowly. The first was sewn into the hem of the bed skirt, thread barely darker than the fabric, hard to spot unless you knew to look. March 21st. First day inside. We chose this. We choose each other. The next was behind a loose floorboard under the wardrobe, a tiny slip of music paper folded 12 times over. When you forget the tune, hum the silence. They were everywhere. Inside coat linings, under drawer false bottoms, behind pages of books. Tiny sentences stitched or scratched or folded, like breadcrumbs left for someone who might care enough to trace the path. And Lena traced them all. Each message, each scrap, led to another. One line beneath a teacup read, "She sings Debussy when the pipes hiss." Another inside a matchbox. "If you see the candle move, it's not wind. It's memory." Lena created a map, not of the house, but of the thoughts Samuel and Shava had left behind. It became a web, a thread that didn't lead in straight lines, but wove around their daily routines, their fears, their dreams. And at the center, the mirror. Small, oval, hung above the desk, its surface long since fogged with age. But when Lena stood in front of it one morning, early light slanting in from the hallway, she saw something behind her. Not in the room, in the reflection. A figure, 2 maybe, blurry, standing near the bed. She turned quickly. Nothing, but her hand trembled as she lifted the mirror from the wall. Behind it, carved gently into the wood, "For the one who finds us, keep us whole." That evening, Lena cried. She didn't know why. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was the ache of recognition. That feeling you get when you finally hear a song that had been stuck in your soul for years. One you didn't know the words to, but had always been humming. She opened her laptop that night and began drafting the article. Not a report, not an academic piece. A story, titled, "The Room That Remembered." She wrote not in footnotes, but in feeling. And in doing so, she heard something new. A fourth knock. Then silence. Then, just for a breath, the scent of rosewater. As if Shava had just passed through. Not gone, just remembered. It was a rainy afternoon when Lena finally found the record. She hadn't been looking for it, not exactly. After weeks of sifting through archives, birth certificates, property ledgers, and deportation manifests with nothing but crossed-out names and blank spaces in return, she had grown used to silence. Samuel and Shava Stein had become almost mythic to her. Not fictional, but intentional, like characters written to be read only by those who needed them most. But on that gray, dripping day, in the back corner of a rusted filing cabinet in the Krakow municipal office basement, she found a single misfiled page from 1947. It was a post-war recovery report, prepared by a housing administrator tasked with cataloging abandoned Jewish properties for state reassignment. Property number 1918, the house at the end of the cobbled lane, was listed as vacant, structurally sound, no sign of occupation, windows sealed in rear. But scrawled in pencil along the margin, as if added as an afterthought, were 5 words. Possible concealment. No entry made. Lena sat back in her chair. The lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting long reflections across the linoleum floor. No entry made. That one sentence confirmed everything. Someone knew, someone suspected, and someone walked away. Whether out of fear or indifference or some quiet, human need to forget, the house had remained untouched. For 70 years, the Steins' hiding place had been shielded not just by walls and mortar, but by human omission. They weren't simply forgotten, they were left. She returned to the house that night with keys and gloves, and the weight of that realization pressing against her ribs. The storm outside hadn't let up. Rain smacked against the windows as if trying to get in. The room greeted her with the same breathless stillness as always. But now she felt it differently. Not as mystery, as mourning. She sat at the desk and opened the journal again. This time, she turned all the way to the back cover and ran her fingers along the spine. There, pressed into the leather, barely legible under layers of oil and time, were initials. Not Yelsey like before. Not Chava's or Samuel's. But hers. LW. She blinked, ran her hand across again. It was impossible. Except it wasn't, because the journal had been rewritten. Not overwritten, but extended. She flipped forward and found the newest page, in her handwriting, though she had no memory of writing it. They never left. Not really. They stayed because no one else remembered. Until now. The candle beside her flickered. The mirror trembled slightly on the wall. And Lena understood. Samuel and Shava may have died in that room. No records would ever say how. Whether by starvation, illness, heartbreak. But their story didn't end there. Because the room hadn't let it. Every whisper, every scrap, every stitch and secret note, they were not just breadcrumbs. They were invitations. And Lena had followed. Not just to uncover, but to carry. She reached under the bed one last time. Pulled out the final box, the one she'd been too afraid to open. Inside, 2 wedding bands. A folded handkerchief embroidered with a red tulip. And a note, handwritten in careful, uneven lines. We leave the rest to you. Lena didn't lock the house when she left that night. She stepped out into the wet dark, coat soaked, hair clinging to her forehead, and simply closed the door behind her, gently, as if not to wake someone sleeping inside. The streets of Krakow were quiet, the way cities always are in the rain. But the weight in her chest wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, saturated, not with grief, exactly, but with reverence. For days afterward, she couldn't stop thinking about that note. We leave the rest to you. She kept returning to the phrase like a puzzle, running it through her fingers, her mind. What exactly had they left her? A room, yes. A journal. Pieces of lives woven into the grain of floorboards and the folds of linens. But also something harder to hold, a choice. By then, the media had caught wind of the discovery. The story had leaked. A historian finds hidden World War II bedroom, untouched for 70 years. News crews wanted interviews. Museum directors called asking about artifact preservation. One even proposed relocating the entire room to Warsaw, rebuilding it piece by piece in an exhibit. Lena refused. It's not just a room, she told them. It's a body. You don't exhume a person to move them across town for convenience. They thought she was being dramatic. But she wasn't. Not to her. Instead, she drafted a proposal. One that didn't ask for fame or display cases. Just quiet. She wanted the house left standing. Maintained, yes. Stabilized. But not altered. The bedroom would remain sealed to the public. No velvet ropes, no foot traffic, no glass boxes. Instead, a single plaque outside. No names, no photographs, just a sentence. This house remembers what was nearly lost. And beneath it, a smaller line, almost imperceptible. Ask gently. Listen deeply. It will speak. Approval was slow. Funding took longer. But by the next spring, the house was protected by the city as a historical site, one of the few Holocaust-related spaces in Europe not open to the public, but preserved in its original stillness. A place where the walls had not only seen, but felt. Lena visited often. She brought students, but never let them inside the room. Instead, they sat in the hallway, and she told them stories, not just of war or dates or tragedies, but of Samuel and Shava, of chess pieces imagined on candlelit tables, of songs hummed into the grain of old wood, of poetry scribbled onto scraps of music sheets. And each time she finished, the students would fall silent, not out of confusion, but respect, because they felt it too, even without entering the room, even without seeing the journal. The house breathed memory. One girl once asked, "Why didn't they leave?" Lena said, "They did." And the girl looked confused until Lena added, "They left themselves here, so we'd know how to find them." And that was enough. That was always enough. It was nearly 30 years later when the journal was found again. The house, now ivy-cloaked and guarded by silence, had long become one of those strange, mythic places passed between generations. School children whispered about it during walking tours, pointing toward the faded brass plaque like it could blink if watched closely. The locals still avoided the street at night, not out of fear but habit, a kind of reverence. Most didn't remember the story. They only knew something important had happened there, something that asked to be left alone. But one boy didn't want to leave it alone. His name was Jonah Weiss, 14, wiry, curious, and built like his grandmother Lena had been, though he didn't know it yet. His father was a groundskeeper for the nearby historical sites, and some afternoons, when his shift ran long, Jonah wandered the perimeter of the old house. That summer was hot, the kind of thick, motionless heat that made even the bricks sweat. On one of those still afternoons, when the cicadas screamed and time seemed to stretch into syrup, Jonah leaned against the outer wall near the rear of the building, the very side where the hidden bedroom had been sealed long ago. A vine snagged his sleeve. As he pulled it free, his hand brushed against something hollow in the wall. Not quite brick, not quite empty. It made a dull, unfamiliar sound. He tapped again. Same thud. Heart quickening, he crouched, tracing the edges of what looked like a seam in the mortar. With effort, he pried a small wooden panel loose, just big enough to fit a hand through. Inside was a space barely the size of a shoebox. And nestled there, wrapped in fabric the color of candlelight, was the journal. He didn't shout, didn't run, just sat down on the warm stone, pulled the fabric away, and opened the first page. The ink had faded, but the message had not. "If you found this, then we are still here." He ran his fingers along the spine. No initials, just a faint floral scent, rosewater and age. He turned the pages slowly, his breath steady, heart soft. He didn't understand everything he read, but the feeling, that deep, humming ache of knowing you were touching something that had once been held, not just written, that he understood perfectly. He read for over an hour, then carefully rewrapped the book. And instead of taking it home, he placed it back in the wall, behind the vine, exactly as he'd found it. Later, when his father asked where he'd gone off to, Jonah shrugged and said, "Just exploring." That night, he sat by his window and began writing in a small, blank notebook of his own. He titled the first page, "They Were Here." And for a long time after, every week or so, he'd return to the wall, open the hidden space, and read a little more. Sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence. Once, as the wind passed gently down the lane, he swore he heard a piano note. Just one. Soft. Perfect. It didn't frighten him. He smiled. Because he knew. Some rooms don't echo. They answer. And some people, no matter how long they've been gone, are never truly silent. Not if we keep turning the page.